My mom had a ring just like yours." The words came out before Janelle could stop them. They hung in the low light of the country club dining room like a single, wrong note. The emerald on the man's hand caught the chandelier and threw a green pulse across the linen. He froze mid-sip. The fork in his other hand clattered against the plate as if the sound were a verdict. He looked older than the picture Janelle had seen on a magazine, worn around the eyes, careful in his gestures. But the ring was unmistakable, deep green, heavy setting, the kind of stone that read like a family crest. For a moment, the polished room lost its edges. Everything focused on that flash of green and the sudden sharpness of the man's face. He was Richard Langford. Janelle had been closing their small evening service, sweeping crumbs from a table where a lone guest lingered. When she said it, she hadn't meant to intrude. Tiredness does strange things. It makes you honest. It strips performative politeness to the bone. She saw the ring, thought of her mother, and said what came. It was an ordinary memory. Angela Brooks's hand. Smaller, thinner. A duller band with a green stone that had never cost much, but had felt like everything after the funeral. A thing to name. A small bridge back to someone who'd held her in the dark. "Tell me more about your mother," the man wrote on the receipt before he left. The handwriting was looping and careful, the ink dark against the glossy paper. He slid it beneath the sugar bowl like a secret. Janelle folded the slip into the pocket of her apron and watched him go, the echo of the plate's clink still in the air. At home, Naomi was asleep with one arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit. The late summer night smelled of fried oil and laundry detergent. Janelle turned the light on at the kitchen counter and spread the receipt like she was opening a letter from someone old. Her fingers trembled a little, not from the heat of the stove but from the sudden hum in her chest. Men with rings like that didn't notice waitresses. Men like that didn't leave notes on napkins. Not in her world. Bills lay in a neat pile like small patient predators. The electric bill glared like an accusation. Naomi would need sneakers for school. The dentist had naggingly suggested a filling. Angela had promised she'd handle that before she died. Promised twice, and then the breathing had stopped. Angela's picture sat in a chipped frame by the phone. Winter light on her smile. Hair pinned back, a small flash of emerald in the bend of her hand, as if she had been caught mid-gesture. Janelle fingered the glass and felt a sudden kinship with shadows, things that remained when someone left. She thought of the note again, then of the smell of the dining room, lemon polish and coffee. Curiosity is a strange thing on top of grief. It doesn't ask permission. It grows gears under your feet until you must follow where it turns. If this story is the kind you want to keep hearing, about people who find more than they expected, hit like and subscribe. There are more truths ahead. Janelle was careful about choices. Raising Naomi alone had taught her that. Choices were measured in the way you stretched $1 across 2 weeks, the way you booked a weekend babysitter with the right blend of flattery and cash. But this was a choice that didn't feel like money. It felt like obligation. Her mother had been secretive in a soft way, as if hiding tenderness from the world. Maybe she deserved to be known. The photograph lay between a stack of yellowed bills and a taped-up shoebox at the back of Angela's closet. Janelle found it when she thought she was looking for recipes. She found it with the indifferent desperation of someone rifling through what belonged to the dead. The picture was folded at the corners, the ink slightly faded, but the logo on a metal gate behind the woman was sharp enough to be read. Langford Holdings. Angela smiled into the camera in a way that looked older than the few lines on her face. Her hair was pinned higher, the collar of her blouse crisp. A man, off to the side, was out of focus, but a company picnic banner hung in the background. The years peeled back. Janelle felt the slow, strange shock of recognition like a hand on the back of her neck. Langford Holdings. The name felt big, like a house you couldn't afford to look into. On the internet, the company was all polished statements, community initiatives, charitable foundations, quarterly growth. There were photographs of people shaking hands under glass atriums, donations to scholarship funds with smiling children who had nothing to do with the dinner table in Janelle's kitchen. A small news article from years ago scrolled up with more weight than its print deserved. Workers injured in an office accident. The words were clinical, list-like, minor injuries, production delays, internal review. Nothing that smelled of blood or wrongdoing. nothing that would on its face indict a name. But the photograph in Angela's box had a date written in ink on the back, and the scrawled name of a street Janelle had never heard. She went back to the shoebox and pushed against the bottom where the tape had turned brittle. Under a bundle of funeral programs she found an envelope, its flap rimmed in age. The address was in Angela's hand, but the return line had a letterhead so faint that it read like a ghost. Langford Holdings. The envelope contained 3 things: a letter, a small newspaper clipping, and a cassette tape tucked into a folded piece of paper marked plainly, almost defiantly, with her mother's name. When she read the letter, Janelle felt like someone had opened a closet and let all the old boxes breathe out at once. The paper smelled faintly of lavender, and something else, machine oil perhaps, left untouched for too long. The handwriting was slanted, affectionate, the letters clustering like people huddled for warmth. It began without preamble, as if it had been written before the writer had allowed herself to think. "You are the best part of what came from that time," Angela had written. The line sat on the page like a small island of light. There was no attempt to explain more. The rest of the letter circled memories. How she had worked late shifts, traded lunches for coins, how she had carried a ring in her pocket for a month before she could tell Janelle why. There were hints, not confessions. A man she had loved despite warnings, a workplace that was louder than it said it was, a small fear of being found out. She wrote the way people sometimes leave instructions for their future selves, careful and precise in hope that someone would follow them. The cassette had no label except a smear of black felt that someone had tried to rub away. It fit in her palm like an artifact, plastic with the sharp smell of old tape. For a foolish second, Janelle imagined pressing it to some ancient player and hearing her mother's laugh crackle out of an old radio. The idea was child's small miracle. Naomi would like that, she thought. Naomi would sit cross-legged and listen to the sound of a grandmother who could not tuck her in anymore. But the clip of paper also had something else folded inside, a small square photograph of Angela at a table, the same emerald glinting in the light. Someone had written in tiny print across the bottom, "Langford Picnic, 1997. The dates pinched like a calendar of old hurt. Angela's death had not been recent. The secret had grown roots over years. That night, Janelle sat in the dark with a flashlight under the blanket in the living room, paper spread like a map. Naomi slept, breath small and regular. The house outside their window was the same that she'd moved into with her mother years before. The fence slumped in one corner, and Mrs. Ruiz's porch light down the street blinked like a guardian. In that hush, the letter felt heavier. It had been folded and tucked away for reasons Janelle tried to imagine as anything but dangerous. There was tenderness in the lines. There was fear as well, the kind that becomes its own shape once it has lasted too long. She could have done nothing. She could have let the note at the country club be one of those small, private mysteries that drifted through days like a leaf in a gutter. But Angela had been guarded not out of malice, but out of protection. And Janelle had a daughter to protect now. She would not let a mother's modest objects evaporate into a story no one told. The meeting was set for a week later in a hotel lobby where the carpet bloomed with old flowers and muted colors, and the recessed lights gave everything the color of someone's memory. Richard Langford was exactly as he had been that night. Measured, polite, the kind of man whose wealth had taught him that even his apologies should be tidy. He did not deny Angela's name. He did not claim it either. His voice was quieter than she expected, rough around the edges in a way that made him seem smaller and more human. "Angela Brooks," he said, as if testing how her name sat in the room. "I remember her. I remember her laugh. She was persistent in a good way." He slid a single envelope across the marble table toward her with no flourish. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but precise. Janelle Brooks. The paper had the soft crease of having been folded many times before being smoothed flat. Inside was another letter written in Angela's hand, the same looping script but with a different tone. This letter read like a map for somebody who would come after, not an explanation but a handing over. "You are the best part of what came from that time," it repeated. Then a paragraph that shimmered with the kind of honesty people only afford when they think no one will read it. Angela had been working late at Langford Holdings when something happened. She had tried to speak up, and the machinery of a company had swallowed her words into an administrative list. There was mention of names, none of them explicit in the way a journalist needs, but small references that fit into a pattern. An accident that had never quite been called an accident, a co-worker who had been too convenient a scapegoat, a supervisor who had been promoted shortly afterward. "I loved someone I knew I shouldn't have," the letter said, and the sentence landed with the density of a stone. It did not name, it did not excuse, it did not plead. It simply stated, and that made the room around it vibrate. Richard watched her read the way someone watches a tender thing being handled. There was a pause that had the tightness of someone considering a confession. "Angela was—" he began, then stopped. He had come with a pocket full of careful apologies, his suit a shield that did not entirely hold. He offered his hand, then withdrew it as if to protect himself from the implausible intimacy of touch. "What did you want me to know?" Janelle asked. It was the barest, most ordinary question. She had rehearsed anger like a speech on the way there and found it difficult to begin. Anger needed a shape. Confusion and fear were more precise. He inhaled, and it sounded like someone stepping onto a stage. "I knew Angela," he said softly. "I knew her more than people might expect. She and I—" He stopped again, choosing his words like stones to lay. "We were part of a history that got complicated. I am sorry for the way that history touched you. If she left this for you, she wanted you to know you were seen." He slid another small object across the table. A key this time, brass dulled by use, not ornate, the sort of key that belonged to an old desk or a lockbox. "There's more," he said. "I don't have it all. I've tried to—" His voice lowered, the confident outline of his sentence blurred. "Be careful who you trust," he told her, and the words arrived like a hand on her shoulder. They were both warning and apology. Janelle left the hotel with the envelope heavy in her bag and a key in her palm that felt too small for the machinery of a corporation. She is the kind of person who reads furniture for secrets. Keys tell their own stories. That evening, the key fit a small cabinet where Angela had kept passports, receipts, and a diary too fragile to read. The lock opened with a sigh. The cassette was inside a shoebox, wrapped in a cloth that had picked up the scent of time. Janelle pressed it to her ear the way you press your hand to a coffin, hoping for warmth. She had no player, of course. Who keeps cassette players now? But in the living room window the moon was a thin coin, and she could imagine for a moment the sound of her mother's voice threading through the thin speaker of an old radio. At dawn, after Naomi had settled with cereal and cartoons, Janelle walked the tape down to a pawn shop that also advertised vintage electronics on the glass. The man behind the counter had a face that had folded like a map around the years. He brought out a recorder from under the counter and set the tape in with the delicacy of a person handling a relic. The hiss came first, a thin white noise that sounded like breath. Then Angela's voice, quieter than the photograph had suggested, layered with the texture of late nights and nicotine, laugh in its measure. Her words began the way people speak into the privacy of a diary. "If something happens to me." The recording started. The sentence tilted like a rock in a stream, promising and terrified. It went on, not in the stream of consciousness Janelle feared, but in a calm, terrifyingly composed cadence. Angela detailed dates, names blurred into initials, places where she had seen things she shouldn't have seen. There was a list of small indignities, and then a shift into something that made Janelle's arms go cold. Talk of an accident that had been swept into the category of minor and misreported, the word negligence said once and not allowed to expand. The cassette was proof of more than memory. It was a voice that could not be easily dismissed. Janelle felt the room tilt under that. Proof, she knew, had the power to turn rumor into accountability. It had the power to make people look, and yet proof made you visible. It was as if the tape had turned a light on a map, and somewhere beyond the cutout of her living room, doors started to crease open. That evening, she took care to keep the tape close. She dropped Naomi at Mrs. Ruiz's and drove the long way, hands knotted on the steering wheel. The streetlights made the black of the SUVs she saw parked on corners look like a deliberate smudge. She would have dismissed it if she had not noticed the same model twice within a mile. Glossy black, windows dark enough to mirror nothing back. When she went by the closed gate of Langford Holdings, a glossy rectangle of glass and steel that had once seemed like a building from a dream, someone in a black SUV rolled past her on the other side of the street and watched as if he had been expecting a story to begin. Richard called the next morning. He was quieter on the line, his voice wrapped in a politeness that had the undertone of someone running out of pretexts. "I was glad you came," he said. "I wish I had handled things differently. There are people who still—" He hesitated, the sentence uncooked. "Be careful who you trust," he repeated. The line clicked like a breath leaving. She began to notice small things, a shadow that fit too well beneath the hedge, a flicker of movement across the street when she pulled into her parking spot, the feeling that someone had been in the house when she stepped inside though the doors were locked. The idea of being watched had a strange intimacy. It pointed every ordinary motion into potential tragedy. Janelle knew worry. She had learned to live with it. But this was not the kind that slept. It sat up and plotted. She took the cassette to a friend who worked at a local community radio station. He had a battered mixing board and a kind face that made it easy to tell things. He put the tape in, listened, and then paled. "This is big," he said simply, as if the rest of the conversation could be arranged around those two ordinary words. "It implicates someone," Janelle said, and the truth of it felt cold and bright. She did not place names at first. Instead, she catalogued possibilities. A cover-up, negligence, the sort of corporate seam that could be stitched quietly with money and silence. Naomi needed a future. Angela deserved to be heard. "Do you want me to make a copy?" he asked. The question assumed an answer. Losing the tape felt like losing a pulse. Janelle nodded, though there was no one to see. Copies were made with the slowness of someone handling something fragile. The voice on the tape seemed to grow with each translation, colors settling into place. There was a clipped sentence about a man who had been promoted after the incident, the kind of promotion that sometimes understood sacrifice as the price of progress. There were names in the margins of Angela's words like broken teeth of a comb, initials and references to meetings and files that had been moved. On the way home, she caught sight of a man taking a photograph from across the park as if he had practiced the angle just for her. He looked up as if to check a lens. For a moment their eyes met, a quick, horrible contact, and then he lowered the camera as if surprised to have been noticed. Her stomach dropped. She had no doubt then that she had threaded into something bigger than grief. That night, there was a knock at the door. Her breath knocked out of her for a second, not with fear, but with the dry anticipation of someone hearing thunder, imagining danger before it arrives. She peered through the peephole. Two men, plain shirts, polite faces, asked if she was Janelle Brooks. Richard's name came with them. They said they were friends of his, wanting to offer condolences. One of them mentioned Langford Holdings in a bored way that did not fit with real sorrow. She let them in out of politeness, and the ridiculous American habit of assuming manners would keep a room safe. They stayed for a half hour, polite and flat, asking questions that were small and routine. Where she'd found the photograph, whether there had been any legal papers. They drank stale coffee and smiled at Naomi in a way the way people smile at children on television. When they left, one of them pressed a business card across the counter with the same corporate logo that showed up on the old photograph. It felt like a stamp. The next morning, a photograph was tucked under her windshield wiper, a black and white print of the country club from that night, cropped tightly on a single car. On the back, someone had scrawled, with the familiar looping hand she had come to dread, the words, "We should talk. Langford." Her hands were steady, but something within her tightened like a fist. She called the number on the business card, and a receptionist answered politely, promising to pass her to someone who could help. The voice on the other end was careful. They asked about the letter, about the cassette. She did not feel safer speaking into the phone. Richard called again that afternoon. "I tried to send someone before," he said. His voice was quieter than before, threaded with an urgency that had teeth. "They wanted to be helpful, I thought." He paused. "There are people who think this matters less than it does. I wish you didn't have this." She could hear a rustle, the hint of someone moving. Be careful who you trust. She told him once, the way you tell a person something small and then realize it contains the ocean. They came to my door, she said. They photographed my car. I'm sorry, he said. The word was small. The apology had a weight that made her look at the key in the tray where she kept small things, the one he had given her. It glinted in the late sun, innocent brass and thin as a thought. That night she took the cassette, the copy, and a photocopy of Angela's letter to Detective Michael Harris at the precinct downtown. He read the letter in a way that was almost professional. His face didn't betray the itch of curiosity. The precinct smelled like coffee and paper and time. He had been polite before, and he was polite now, but his eyes worked like a mechanism. He asked questions. Where had she found the photograph? What exactly did the tape contain? Who had been to her home? When she told him about the men, he straightened. People like him lived in the space between everyday risk and the law. He wrote notes and made calls. We can open an inquiry, he said. But I'll be honest. Cases like this can take time, and they take cooperation. He looked at her with an expression that asked if she wanted to risk the time it would take. I want the truth, she told him simply. Naomi deserved a world where facts could be made to square. My mother deserves that much. Harris stood buttoning his jacket. I'll do what I can, he said, and Janelle left with the echo of that commitment like a small coin in her pocket. Outside the precinct, the afternoon had gone thin. A black SUV idled by a corner, engine tick-ticking like a watch. She felt eyes on the back of her neck and did not turn. There are moments in life when you become aware of the machinery of other people's watching, and there is no turning away from the sound of it. She walked faster, keys in hand. At home that night, Naomi lay with her head on Janelle's lap, hair smelling like the shampoo Mrs. Ruiz used. Janelle told her a story about a girl who found a hidden map, a story which softened into something else, the father Angela had loved who never got to meet the child he had. She kept the language small and kind, not yet ready to explain the men or the photographs. Naomi listened, eyes wide with the simple, absolute belief that stories were promises. The cassette was on the table like an accusation. There was another sound now beyond the hiss of tape, the slow, almost imperceptible hum of a machine that sometimes appears when people are watched. It could have been imagination. It could have been someone else's device. Either way, it made the apartment feel less private. Janelle drove to the old house one morning, a place that had been waiting like some patient animal. The lock on the gate protested with a squeal when she pushed it. Inside, the room smelled of dust and lemon oil. Papers were stacked, as if a person had left mid-task. The lockbox sat in the bottom of Angela's closet, its combination a memory that Janelle pieced together like a puzzle from small notes. The key Richard had given opened it, and inside there were more receipts. Another photograph of Angela with a receptionist's badge that had a badge number, and a small stack of typewritten pages with redactions like someone had tried to sell a story to Time and then changed their mind. One sheet in particular had a headline clipped out, Langford Facility Under Review. The article was full of the soft language of corporate press releases. Minor operational incidents, internal assessment ongoing. But stapled to it was a payroll slip with a signature that matched one of the initials mentioned on Angela's tape, and, tucked into the folds, an old cassette labeled in hand. Angela B. 07-1998. She took it like a person accepting an offered heart. The tape smelled of her mother's skin. She placed it in her bag. As she turned to leave, the black SUV cruised by slowly, hood glinting. The driver glanced and then looked away, the motion too practiced to be casual. Back at her car, she felt a new gravity. The tape, the letters, the key. They had turned into a center. The world seemed drawn toward that point, as if everyone else had been orbiting, and only now the moon had shifted. On the drive home, Janelle thought of Angela sitting late at a kitchen table, of the small gestures that add up into a life. She thought of gifts kept in pockets, of smiles that hide hard things. The cassette had given her a voice that could be replayed, scrutinized, argued over. It would not, she knew, erase the slow ways of power, but it could be used to make the world look at the thing it had not wanted to see. She set the kettle and watched the steam fog the window. The house felt younger and older at once, Somewhere the sound of a car door closed with too much care. She opened the envelope Richard had given her again and smoothed the paper like a map. There was a small paragraph she had not fully understood the first time she read it, a sentence that now tasted like ash. If she left this for you, she wanted you to know you were seen. At the edge of that seeing was the dawning possibility of exposure, and with it, the dangerous light of people who wished not to be seen. The tape sang a bright line into the air. It made people nervous. It made people plan. The next morning, a photograph was slipped under her door. A grainy shot of the hotel from the night she had met Richard. Her chest tightened again. Someone had been watching more than the streets. They had been watching the meeting places between the wealthy and the grieving. The black SUV had been waiting. She called Richard. There was a long pause before he answered, as if he had been expecting the call and was admitting that he had hoped she would not make it. I tried to handle it, he said at once. I tried to tidy what could be tidied, to keep people from being hurt. But there are people who... His voice broke on the thought. There are people who will not be calm about their brand. Who? She asked, wanting the name as if a name could be a shield. He did not name Victor Crane then, though she would later learn his name like the mention of a shadow across a room. There are partners who prefer things to remain undisturbed, Richard said instead. If you have anything that could embarrass them, you have their attention. When he finally said it, slowly, like a word he had tasted too often. Be careful who you trust. It carried an edge that was both compassionate and terrified. Janelle folded the paper and tucked it against the stack on the counter. Naomi's sneakers needed a new pair. The electricity bill was due next week. There were practical things that assumed priority like small, loud animals. There were also the choices that reshaped your life into an argument about what it means to be a parent. She thought of the tape and what it might demand from her. She thought of Angela, of the ring catching light in a country club room, of a man whose face read the way guilt does when it is close to becoming accountability. Outside, a black SUV eased from the curb like a shadow uncoiling. Janelle watched it through the kitchen window, then turned away and began the slow, ordinary preparations of keeping a home. There would be calls to make, people to speak to, decisions to take. There would be risk. There would be nights where the small shapes of things, keys, pictures, tapes, would feel like the handles of a rope you pull when you don't know what you'll haul in. She could not yet see the end of that rope. She only knew the start. A ring, a sentence on a receipt, a voice on a tape that said, in the first brittle seconds, if something happens to me. She slid the cassette into its cloth and, for the first time since she had found it, let herself imagine Angela's voice floating in the air like smoke, tracing the lines of a life someone else had kept for her. The house was full of ordinary noises. The hum of the refrigerator, Naomi's muffled laugh at a cartoon, the distant thump of someone dropping by a neighbor's porch. But beneath those sounds was another, subtler one. The feeling that the world had shifted a fraction, and that the balance of what could be hidden had changed. She had pulled a thread. The cloth had begun to unravel. She had pulled a thread. The cloth had begun to unravel. When the call came, it was an officious voice from a number she didn't recognize. Someone at the estate, they said, having found Richard Langford unresponsive in his study. A paramedic had pronounced him dead at the scene. The voice made it sound tidy, final, with the language of inevitability. Cardiac arrest, natural causes. Janelle's stomach turned over, a small animal startled. She hadn't expected mourning for a man whose ring had been a doorway. She'd expected questions. She'd expected hesitation, perhaps a fight to be heard. Not this, an abrupt erasure of a witness, a man who had been both a gatekeeper and a reluctant ally. She drove to the address Richard's assistant had given her, feeling every light on the road as if someone could read the rhythm of her brakes like a map. The house was a slab of glass and stone set on a manicured lawn, hedges clipped into the dignity of other people's money. Luxury had a smell. Lemon oil and cut grass and something faintly metallic that felt like the scent of decisions being made. Uniformed officers stood at the gate with expressions practiced into neutrality. A line of cars trailed down the drive, umbrellas and murmured condolence folded into the estate's cool rooms. Inside, People moved in the smooth choreography of wealth accustomed to disarray being contained. A woman from the company, someone who had written speeches and RSVP lists for years, stood in a powder blue dress, her voice an even baritone of sympathy. Richard's assistant drifted from group to group like a conductor softening an orchestra. Janelle felt suddenly like an intrusion, a human who had been given a private line into a public grief. Detective Michael Harris found her first. He had the same economy of motion he'd shown at the precinct. He didn't reach for small talk. "I'm sorry you had to hear it from someone else," he said, and the apologetic tone held more than courtesy. He asked where she'd been the night before, if she'd spoken to Richard in recent days, what exactly the tape contained. She told him. He listened the way he always did, as if arranging facts into a readable picture. "There's something odd about this," he admitted later in a voice shaded away from the cluster of mourners. "Langford's security team is saying surveillance went dark between midnight and 2 a.m. The backup file is corrupted. That could be a simple failure. It could also be intentional." Janelle pictured the black SUV again, the man taking the photograph, the polite men in plain shirts with business cards pressed like threats into her palm. She thought of the coffee cups and the polite smiles at her door. She remembered Richard's hands, the way he slid the key across the hotel table, the quiet notice in his voice. "Be careful who you trust." Now the warning rang like an omen. At the funeral a week later, corporate brass filled the front rows. There were chrysanthemums and polite sentiments read from yellowed index cards. A video montage on the big screen showed Richard in staged charity photos, shaking hands with scholarship kids, planting trees, smiling in still frames that had clearly been chosen for soft lighting. A hush moved through the room when a colleague spoke of his commitment to the company and its people. The words felt calibrated, as if grief had been given a script. Between camera flashes and the shuffling of programs, Janelle watched Victor Crane glide in, a sharper cut of suit than the others, as if his clothes had been tailored to the exact angle of a jawline. His presence didn't surprise her. Once he'd been a rumor attached to Langford's name in the corners of old financial reports, a man who made deals with a narrow smile. He looked at her only briefly, a passing consolidation of attention, then away, an evaluation that felt like a cold calculation. At his elbow were other men in plain shirts. They carried the air of people given assignments and forgetting what they had been assigned to feel. After the funeral, in a small private room where some of Richard's oldest acquaintances wept into one another's hands, an older woman who'd been Richard's neighbor for decades approached Janelle. She was small, with hair gone the color of winter wheat, and when she spoke her voice was like newspaper, thin but carrying inked truth. "He regretted a lot," she said simply. "He used to sit by my fence and talk about things he wished he'd done differently. It wasn't all clean, child, but he did try, in his own way." This was not absolution so much as a witness to contradiction, that a man could be complicit and yet capable of remorse, that wealth could be a cloak and sometimes a way to atone in gestures that came too late. The woman's words became part of Janelle's restless ledger, evidence of Richard's moral ambivalence she would carry alongside the envelope he had given her. Back at home there were new envelopes, a thin letter from a law firm, typed, businesslike. It explained, briefly, and with the careful distance of legal counsel, that Richard had made certain provisions in a codicil to his will. There was money set aside in trust for the child of Angela Brooks, the document read, phrasing that felt both legal and parenthetical. It was enough to cover Naomi's immediate needs, a set of payments to be administered as the trust's terms allowed, not a vanishing festival of riches, but a steadying hand. The letter also offered a seriousness, an invitation to speak with the estate attorney about the logistics. The lawyers were precise and patient, the way people are when they must render human comfort into paperwork. Janelle stared at the letter until the words blurred. A part of her wanted to reject it as symbolic, wealth thrown like a bomb where it couldn't soothe the real absence. Another part of her felt a weight ease, the slow loosening of a knot that had tightened around Naomi's future. She told herself the money would not fix everything, and it would not. But it would make the small necessary things possible. A dentist visit without negotiating days off, a pair of sneakers that would not be mended for a third season. Practicalities kept you honest. The police investigation, however, was not satisfied with neatness. Detective Harris pushed on the fragmentary details, the corrupted security footage, statements that kept shifting, a broken glass on the terrace that didn't match the narrative of natural cardiac arrest. The coroner's report came back noting injury inconsistent with a simple fall. There was, he told her carefully, the language of possible foul play. He did not leap to sensational conclusions. He wrote them into reports, numbered and placed, a surgeon of documents. When the estate's security footage was finally examined by an independent tech brought in at Harris's request, the missing segment had been removed with the sort of competence that marked a deliberate hand. Someone had known where the file was stored and how to make it pretend it had never existed. The realization that someone had done more than drive past her house, that someone had reached into systems designed to keep secrets, made the world of polished corridors and glass facades look less like ivory and more like a machine built to swallow mistake and witness alike. The press caught on. Once there were hints of foul play attached to a name like Langford, microphones multiplied. Reporters began to weave the fragments into longer sentences. The line between rumor and reality blurred and then snapped back into clarity with every published copy of Angela's photograph and the mention of the tape. The local NPR station ran a segment on corporate responsibility with Richard's name in the background, and someone with a blog posted a grainy photograph of the black SUV in a parking lot by the Langford facility. People began to call the office, and the office returned calls with statements that avoided the words negligence and cover-up. Victor Crane, in public, was all composition and restraint. He issued terse statements about cooperating with authorities and supporting an internal audit. In closed doors, according to sources who told reporters later in drips of anonymity, his tone sharpened. He demanded a narrative that read like continuity. He wanted the story contained and the leak plugged. Those who knew him described his approach as surgical. He preferred to remove variables quietly. For Janelle, the tension widened like a crack along the house's foundation. She began to move differently, no longer simply a woman going about the small chores of parenting, but someone who had interest aligned against power. She met with journalists and with the detective and with the estate's attorney. She guarded the tape, the original and copies, as if it were a breathing thing. She slept in short slices, Naomi a warm weight beside her, her small hand tucked into Janelle's like a compass. The confrontation came on a rain-slick Thursday when Victor Crane agreed to meet at a neutral venue, a coffee shop 2 blocks from his offices, a place intentionally devoid of ceremony. He arrived with a silent entourage and a look that did not pretend to sympathy. When he sat across from her, his space smelled of expensive cologne and determination. "You shouldn't have come," he said without preface, leaning forward. He had the sort of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He made sentences look like inevitabilities. "I would have handled it." "You handled it," Janelle said, and her voice surprised her with how steady it was. "You handled it in a way that hid people and left my mother's name in a box. That is something I couldn't let stand." Victor's hand tapped the table. "You understand the danger of rumors," he said. "You understand how this can spiral. Men like Langford, they make mistakes. We fix them. That's what companies do. We fix things for the greater good." "Fixing things shouldn't mean erasing people," Janelle said. "My mother kept a voice for a reason. Listen to it." She set a phone face up on the table and hit play. The hiss filled the small room, a private old sound that made the barista glance over as if a radio had come to life in the wrong era. Angela's voice threaded through the speakers with its brittle strength. "If something happens to me," it began, and the barista's brow tightened in sympathy at the words of an absent woman recalling fear. Victor's face didn't blanch. Instead, his jaw made the slow movement of someone closing a case file inside his mouth. "This is, inconvenient," he said carefully. "It's truth," she corrected. "Not inconvenient. Truth." He smiled as if she had made a joke he chose not to laugh at. "You know how the world runs, Ms. Brooks. There are reputations at stake. There are people whose livelihoods—" "Are you threatening me?" she asked. The question landed between them like a small stone thrown into quiet water. He waved a hand as if to dismiss the seriousness of a question he had planted. "I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. There are ways to handle this that don't involve spectacle." The detective, who'd arranged the meeting under the pretense of wanting to keep an eye on things, did not step from his seat. But his presence was a low indication that the room was not entirely Crane's. Janelle felt the authority like a rope at her back. Her palms were steady. "There is no handling here," she said. "There is accountability." Victor's smile tightened. "You realize, of course, that once something goes out, you can't put it back in." "That's the point," she said. "You can't put truth back in its box." He leaned back, calculating. Then he did something more dangerous than overt threat. He offered a softer manipulation. "You could have help," he said. "Money to care for your daughter quietly. An agreement, non-disclosure. We can arrange for comfort, for Naomi, if that's what you want." The offer arrived with the taste of a poison-laced candy, generous on the surface but intent on silence. Janelle pictured Naomi's smile and the way the child slept with one leg over the edge of the mattress, whole and unaware. The money would solve things in the short term. Signing away a parent's right to speak would cost something she could not afford to exchange. "No," she said plainly. "I won't sell my mother's voice." Victor's expression hardened into something older and more dangerous. "You are making enemies, Ms. Brooks. People don't like being embarrassed." "People don't like being exposed," she corrected again. But she had no time for debates that masked the syllables of moral choice. "If what my mother said is true, then people were hurt. They deserve to know. You can't sweep that." A man in a suit at Victor's side closed his hand around a small envelope and slid it to Janelle under the table. For a flash, she thought it was the cash she'd imagined. Instead, it held a photograph. It was taken in bad light and had the grainy quality of a phone camera. It was of Detective Harris outside a coffee shop with a man whose face she did not know, shaking hands. Someone in Victor's world wanted her to think Harris was compromised. "Be careful who you trust," Victor said, repeating the line with an emphasis that turned it into accusation. He tapped the photograph with the kind of lightness that is a practiced weapon. "You should ask yourself who profits from this." She slid the photograph back. Her heart beat like a drum inside her ribs, each strike a call to courage. "I trust a voice on a tape before I trust a photograph meant to distract," she said. "And if you have anything to hide, we'll let the proper authorities sort it." He laughed then, a small short sound. "Proper authorities answer to the same pressures that answer to you." He folded his hands. "You're brave, Ms. Brooks. Brave and naive." She left before the conversation could sour entirely. As she stood, Victor Crane's gaze rested on the brass ring of her keychain, Richard's key, glinting in the light. For a moment their eyes held across the small room like a ledger closing entries. A week later, the world swelled around them. The tape made its way, through the journalist who had offered anonymity, and through a legal intermediary, into public ears. There were careful edits, transcripts posted online, the hiss of Angela's voice transcribed and placed beside her photograph. Media outlets described hairline fractures in the corporate narrative. Bloggers and op-eds took up the chorus. Citizen protest organized itself with the speed of a contagion. People who had once trusted Langford Holdings to provide scholarships and park benches now asked questions that cut into boardrooms. Victor's response was swift and legalistic. Libel warnings, privacy suits, a crisis PR team that spun press releases into careful denials. He did not call Janelle by name publicly, but the machinery of implication spread like an oil slick, threatening to dull the clarity of the tape. The company's initial statements could not erase Angela's voice. Words recorded could not be simply wished away. Then something else happened that would not have been polite or tidy no matter how much money tried to arrange it. A security guard came forward with a photograph taken the night of Richard's death, an image from an angle the estate's internal cameras hadn't captured. It showed a silhouette in the study doorframe, the angle revealing a brief movement, a shadow intersected by the glint of glass. It was grainy, but to the trained eye it contradicted the initial claim of a quiet night, alone. The guard admitted he'd kept it out of fear for his job, but when he saw the news cycle, he chose truth over silence. Detective Harris filed it, carefully, the way a man stitches together a coat to keep someone from going cold. Once the photograph existed in official record along with the missing files and Angela's tape, the net tightened around the things that had been untidy for too long. Victor Crane's public face did not change, but the pressure on his empire increased. An internal investigation was announced. External auditors were invited. Executives took leaves of absence. The board, who had once called decisions strategic, began to refer to regrettable lapses and lessons learned. The language of culpability softened into passive voice. Then, in a move that seemed to be as much legal theater as consequence, Victor Crane was placed under temporary detention after the guard's photograph and further corroboration turned up. The charge was not murder. Authorities were cautious, mindful not to promise outcomes they did not have. Instead, he was brought in regarding obstruction of evidence and corporate malfeasance, charges that, in the public light, felt like a gauze ripped from eyes. The news cycle called it a turning point. For Janelle, it felt like vindication and still not enough. Someone had died. A secret had been kept for decades. Money placed in an envelope did not undo bones broken by someone else's carelessness. But truth, once shouted into a public square, has a way of being more durable than silence. Richard's death was investigated with a slow, patient momentum. Forensics found glass on his study floor, consistent with a scuffle, and traces under his fingernails that suggested contact. The security footage remained corrupted. The backup's metadata suggested deletion by someone with access to the estate's systems. The coroner's revised report used careful language, homicide pending further inquiry, phrased in a way that was cautious, but honest. The phrase landed like a measured strike. In the days after Victor's detention, Janelle received a note from an older woman who had once been a secretary at Langford Holdings. It came folded and yellowed with age, handed to her by a reporter who disliked the modernness of email. The woman had written in small letters about conversations overheard at a copier, about memos that vanished into drawers, about men who had been promoted in the aftermath of accidents. "We were told to keep things tidy," she wrote. "We were told to believe not our eyes but the company line." Her note was not dramatic. It was instead a collection of tiny corroborative details. With each new piece, the story grew less like a single thread and more like a tapestry. When the district attorney convened a panel to examine the evidence, cameras clustered like moths. Janelle sat in the back of the small hearing room clutching the photograph of Angela at the picnic. She felt like an instrument being played by larger hands, but the notes were hers to hold. The DA's office, careful as a surgeon's assistant, read transcripts in public and released documents with redactions neatly applied. Reporters found ways to interpret redactions into argument. The pressure on the defense was legal, as much as reputational. Victor maintained his denial, his claim that his detention was political theater, but in private counsel he tallied options that smelled of resignation. When the first public arraignment took place, marked as dramatized in some outlets that wanted caution, there were enough witnesses to at least craft a plausible narrative of negligence and subsequent concealment. Jurisdictional complexities and corporate legal defenses added noise, but the public had seen Angela's voice, had heard the tape, had seen the photograph. For many, the spectacle of it all was satisfying simply because it meant that the vault of privacy was beginning to open. After months of hearings and committee meetings and press conferences, the estate's firm finally sent a letter not of money or counsel, but of apology. It arrived like a small, brittle thing in the mail, a statement acknowledging failures in oversight and promising to implement reforms. It did not, could not, say all the things Janelle wanted. No sentence could bring Angela back, but it offered public recognition that a silence had been imposed, and that recognition was the first line of repair. Richard's role in the story remained complicated. At the funeral, at the neighbor's bench, that older woman had said he had tried to make amends. There were notes he had left for colleagues that suggested a man trying to shift the machinery he'd once fueled. These gestures didn't cancel the complicity. They did, however, expand the moral landscape. People are rarely only villains or saints. They are messy and resist neat classification. The world, for all its hunger for clear narratives, had to hold both the fact that some had erred, and that some, Richard among them, had been shaken by what they'd been part of. Then, a small administrative miracle. A letter arrived from the estate attorney confirming that a discretionary fund had been established in Naomi's name. The trust would not make them rich, but it would pay for a stable set of bills, dental work, after-school programs, a modest scholarship-like cushion for high school. The letter included an explanation for the decision, couched in legalese. In consideration of Mr. Langford's expressed wish to provide for the child of Angela Brooks, it felt to Janelle like a brittle form of justice, acknowledgement and practical support without fanfare. She sat on her kitchen floor that night with the letter open and Naomi asleep on a couch nearby, a nightlight casting her child in a pool of warm yellow. For a long time she said nothing. The town's unremarkable sounds continued, a neighbor's television, the distant thump of music, and in that quiet she considered what had come undone and what had been rewoven. There was grief, for her mother, whose life had been half hidden, for the man who had died under clouded circumstances, for the ways in which people cover their mistakes with the polite cloth of denial. There was also now a small space for rest. She had not wanted the money to be the end of things. It wasn't. It was a beginning of a future where Naomi could be less bound by worry and more guided by choices. The trust required meetings, signatures, proof of identity, mundane bureaucratic steps that felt like a ritual of acceptance. Janelle signed the papers not because she wanted to be thanked, but because it felt like closing an old door to make room for a new one. At Richard's private memorial, smaller and less stage-managed than the funeral, people told different versions of the man. A security guard spoke about the man giving an extra cup of coffee to someone who had worked a double shift. A former intern shared a note Richard had written in a journal about wanting to do better, a phrase that was equal parts contrition and aspiration. An older woman who had worked with him recalled a phone call where he had asked how to make things right. The stories were not uniform. They were, however, human. After the memorial, as people dispersed into the crisp fall air, Victor Crane waited in a cluster of lawyers and shuddered his expression into something resembling a pause in a symphony. He was not yet undone. Legal battles take time and money and the right set of witnesses. But he was unmasked in ways that made continuation of business as usual more complicated. Janelle stood with Naomi at her side, her daughter's hand small in hers, and watched. The ring, Angela's emerald, was not much, a thin band and a stone save made brighter by memory. She traced the metal with her thumb and felt in it a small, steady warmth. The ring had been the hinge that opened a room for truth. It had been, improbably, the thing that had changed the trajectory of their lives. There were repercussions, of course. There were threats and emails that never came to anything, likely because Detective Harris and the press made threats less practical. There were also offers of support, neighbors who brought casseroles, a teacher from Naomi's school who suggested scholarship programs, and a woman from the church who offered to help with a fundraising bake sale. The community's response was a small, bright counterweight to the cold corporate apparatus. It reminded Janelle that truth has allies beyond courtrooms, friends who call when you are tired, neighbors who mow your lawn without asking, small hands that belong to children who deserve a future less complicated by the past. Months later, after Victor's indictment on obstruction charges, an outcome framed publicly as an ongoing legal matter to preserve due process, Janelle sat in a small public hearing and watched as Angela's name was read aloud into the record. It was not a court of final judgment. It was a public acknowledgement that the story had been more than rumor. People in the gallery clapped quietly, some of them strangers who had been moved by the podcast about the case or a social media thread that refused to let the matter sleep. For a moment, Janelle felt the thing she had been fighting for, a sound that would not be silenced any longer. If there was a cost for that, it was measured in sleepless nights and small, sharp moments of fear. There were no cinematic chases or showdowns, just depositions, documents, and interviews, mundane, patient things that eventually pull knots apart. Janelle learned to live with the knowledge that history does not always give neat endings. She kept photos, letters, and the cassette in a cardboard box lined with tissue paper. Naomi asked small questions sometimes, about a grandmother she hadn't known. And Janelle answered with care and the truth she could offer. One quiet evening after all the hearings had cooled for a while, Janelle went to the little community center where a group had gathered to talk about corporate accountability. She sat near the back, Naomi at her feet, and listened as an older woman talked about the courage it takes to speak. The woman, who worked in a union office and had taught people how to file complaints, said simply, "Voice is the only weapon some of us have." Janelle thought about how small details can change histories. An emerald catching chandelier light, a handwritten note left on a receipt, the hiss of a cassette tape that preserved a voice. She thought about the men who had been quietly rescued by power and the people who had nothing but testimony. She thought about Richard, a man who had worn the wrongness on his face in moments and tried, badly and late, to set it right. The moral texture of people and institutions had revealed itself to be more variegated than she had imagined. Some people were greed, some were remorse, and some, like Angela, had been silenced until the sound of them could not be ignored. At home that night, she tucked Naomi into bed and smoothed the blanket up to her chin. The trust would help with practicalities, pediatric trips, and school clothes, and that, in a way, was the clearest manifestation of care. Money would not replace a mother. It would, however, buy space to breathe. Janelle placed Angela's photograph and the ring on the small mantel by the kitchen window. Outside, the neighborhood was ordinary. A dog barked and then fell silent. A porch light blinked. She touched the emerald until the metal warmed against her skin. "We heard you," she whispered. Not for anyone to answer, but because the ritual of speaking makes the world different. "They finally heard you." The tape, the photographs, and the letters remained a part of public record, cited in hearings and in pieces that argued for better oversight of places where accidents had been quietly rebranded as misfortune. Victor Crane would fight the charges. Legal systems are slow, and public life often moves on before all verdicts are in. But for Janelle, the immediate work had been done. Her mother had a voice again, and Naomi had the small, practical security of a future that did not depend solely on daily miracles. When Detective Harris stopped by one afternoon, bringing with him the low, comfortable presence he'd developed since they'd first met, he handed her a plain envelope. Inside was a note from Richard, discovered among his personal effects and dated months before his death. His handwriting was careful, and the paper smelled faintly of his aftershave. He had written about regret and a hope that Janelle would use the truth as she saw fit. "Do not let me be an excuse for silence," one sentence read. It was not a clean absolution. It was a plea. At his private memorial, the older neighbor's testimony about Richard's remorse had seemed to soften something inside the community. People are complex. They contain contradictions and, sometimes, the desire to atone. That desire can be sincere, even if it never fully erases harm. In the quiet that followed, Janelle found herself telling Naomi stories of Angela. Not the sanitized, press-friendly anecdotes, but the small, human things. How Angela folded a towel with the care of someone stacking hope. How she hummed when she cooked. The exact way she'd cup a child's chin to make them smile. Naomi listened, and then fell asleep. The breath of a child who trusts adults to hold the world in a way that keeps them safe. The last months had taught Janelle many things. How to live with fear while refusing to be governed by it. How to navigate public scrutiny without surrendering the private dignity of grief. How to accept help without feeling it was charity. She had also learned the cost of silence and the strength of courage, small enough to be sustainable. Showing up to uncomfortable meetings, handing a tape to a journalist, sitting in a waiting room while a legal system did its slow, clumsy work. On an afternoon when the light slanted across the kitchen like a warm hand, Naomi found the old receipt folded in an apron pocket where Janelle had once kept it. She read the words aloud in a child's voice. "Tell me more about your mother," and asked simply, "Why did he care?" Janelle put her hand on Naomi's shoulder and watched the child's face, a map of curiosity and trust. "He noticed," she said. "And sometimes when someone notices, other people have to listen too." They walked to the window and held the emerald ring between them, watching the green catch the sun and throw a small, certain light into the room. It felt like an answer, small and imperfect, but real. They had pulled a thread, and the world had obliged by showing what lay behind the fabric. Small injustices corrected through patient, persistent truth-telling. A man's complicated remorse. A child's future secured enough to let a mother breathe. Janelle kept the cassette where she could reach it, Not to replay the sorrow, but to remember the voice that had set everything in motion. Sometimes she placed it next to the photograph on the mantel and let it sit with the ring as if they were a family's constellations. Naomi would ask from time to time if she could hear her grandmother, and Janelle would say one day, "When you're older, we'll listen together." For now, they carried the sound inside them, a private archive of bravery. When the story had its moment in the sun and the cameras moved on, people would sometimes come up to Janelle on sidewalks or in the grocery aisle and say, quietly, "Thank you for speaking up." The thanks was never for money or notoriety. It was for the courage to refuse to let a life be whispered away. She learned to accept gratitude with the same awkward grace people show when given a gift they didn't know they'd needed. At night, when the house settled and small sounds sounded large, she would take the ring in her hand and whisper the same line she'd said in the country club months ago. Not because it was a performance, but because it was a truth that had opened doors. "My mom had a ring just like yours," she would say into the dark. And somewhere between the stone and the silence, she felt a response that was not from the living, but from the living memory of those who refused to be erased. The media's appetite for headlines faded as it always does, but the work that followed, regulatory scrutiny, boardroom changes, a cautious re-examination of safety practices, moved forward in quiet committees and formal letters. It was not the clean sweep of instant justice, but it reshaped the ordinary conditions that had allowed Angela's voice to be minimized. For Janelle, that was enough to measure a small victory. Until then, she collected the ordinary victories: Naomi's new sneakers, a trip to the dentist without counting pennies, a volunteer placement that let her meet other mothers who had stories they were afraid to tell. In the slow wake of the storm, life resumed with small stitches, each one a choice to keep telling the truth. On a clear morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen table and the ring flashed green like a promise, Janelle held the photograph of Angela and said out loud, "We were listening." She felt the sentence settle into the room like a small piece. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes truth matters, and tell us in the comments if you've ever uncovered a family secret.